I grew up in a house where love had rules and approval had a price, where attention flowed like a river toward my younger sister, Clara, and trickled like a stingy tap toward me if I stood just right and said the exact right thing. The kind of home where my achievements were politely acknowledged and promptly shelved while hers were celebrated with balloons and cake and a parade of relatives cooing over her as if she were made of light. And I was only the shadow she cast. When we were children, it was small things. Clara got the bigger slice, the newer dress, the warmest praise, and I learned to live with it, to measure my worth in quiet perseverance. I told myself that if I worked hard, if I kept my head down, if I sharpened my edges into something useful, then maybe love would find its way to me too. By the time we reached our 20s, the pattern was stitched into everything. At dinners, conversations bent toward Clara's stories. When I got a scholarship, my father smiled and said, "That's nice," then asked Clara how her training at the dance studio was going. When I paid the rent on time and kept the apartment clean, my mother would sigh about how much potential Clara had and how we all had to support her while she found herself, and I would nod and swallow the taste that rose in my throat. It wasn't that Clara was a monster from the start. She was charming in that effortless way that makes people hand over their trust, and she learned early that our parents' affection was a currency she could spend. If she needed a favor, she'd tilt her head just so. If she wanted forgiveness, she'd cry quiet tears with a tremble in her voice, and the world would open for her like an automatic door. I thought I understood her, thought I could navigate around her hunger for the spotlight, the way you skirt a puddle on the way to work. But envy is a quiet gardener, and it pruned her kindness until only pretty vines were left, creeping and decorative and strangling anything that tried to grow beneath them. That autumn, rain came early, and our apartment windows wore a gray sheen for days. I worked late shifts at the library and studied for a certification exam I hoped would nudge me into a better job, while Clara drifted in and out between auditions and part-time gigs that never seemed to stick, returning with stories about people who adored her, who promised to call, who might change everything. On the night that changed mine, my hands were ink-stained from note-taking, and my shoulders ached from hours hunched over practice tests. Thunder rolled like a tired drum, and the clock on the stove ticked past 10 when Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway, haloed by the dim light from the hall. "You're still at it?" she asked, her voice soft, friendly even, and I remember thinking how pretty she looked in that oversized sweater. Her hair pulled back, the faintest smile on her lips as if she were a sister from a gentler universe. "You should take a break," she said. I made soup. She lifted a pot lid and steam breathed into the room, fragrant and warm. The aroma was comforting in that generic way of comfort foods. Onions turned sweet, a hint of herbs, the roundness of something starchy breaking down into silk. I blinked at the pot, then at her, and felt that old tug-of-war inside me. Suspicion on one end, hope on the other. Clara didn't cook. Clara ordered, tasted, and passed judgment. But she ladled out a bowl with care, setting it on a placemat as if she'd been doing this all her life. "You've been pushing yourself," she said, tapping a spoon against the rim. "You always do. I thought I'd help. Help." The word landed like a coin. I wanted it to buy something good. I sat, drew the bowl closer, and watched the steam fog my glasses. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it, because I still wanted us to be two sisters on a rainy night, not rivals playing chess with invisible pieces. The first sip was hot enough to sting my tongue. I tasted the sweetness of softened vegetables, the feathered salt, the faint metallic echo that could have been from the pot itself, I told myself, from the old pipes, from anything ordinary and harmless. Clara watched me, chin propped on her hand, an attentive hostess. "Is it okay?" she asked. "It's good," I said and took another sip. Something tightened low in my stomach. I blamed the hours, the stress, the way my body had learned to run on coffee and grit. She pushed the spoon toward me. "Eat," she urged. "You always forget to take care of yourself." I ate. I told her I'd finish the practice set after a break, that the exam scared me in a way nothing else did because it felt like a doorway that would either open or slam in my face, and she nodded with sympathetic eyes, the kind you could fall into if you didn't know they sometimes reflected nothing. Halfway through the bowl, the room tilted. Just a degree, a barely perceptible shift. and a hollow sound tunneled through my ears as if someone had cupped their hands over them. Clara's face sharpened, her features lengthening in the odd way faces do when you're caught between steady ground and a drop. "Hey," she said, rising smoothly. "You look pale." I tried to smile, to say it was fine, that I'd gone too long without real food, but my tongue felt thick, uncooperative. A tremor ran across my fingers. The spoon clinked against porcelain like a bell rung too hard. "I think," I started, but the words were moths battering at a window. Heat poured through me in a wave that carried needles. My heartbeat stumbled and galloped, tripping over itself. "Let's get you to the couch," Clara said, gentle and practical, and slipped an arm under mine. Her skin was cool. I remember the smell of her shampoo as she steadied me, the clean citrus glide of it, and I remember the way my feet didn't quite land where I thought they would, as if I'd misjudged the edges of my own body. "I'm okay," I said, though my throat closed on the last syllable. A taste rose in my mouth, dull, wrong, and the floor heaved. I caught the counter with both hands. Somewhere outside, a car splashed through a puddle. The clock said 10:14. The numbers blinked, and I blinked, and the world blinked out and back in, a picture sliding in and out of its frame. "Just breathe," Clara murmured, her lips near my ear. "Don't fight it." The words weren't quite right, not for a sister helping a sister through a dizzy spell. They were shaped like kindness, but filled with something else, and all at once every small memory rearranged itself. Her quick hands removing my name from the sign-up sheet for the debate competition in 10th grade. The way she had told a boyfriend of mine a secret I'd trusted her with. The careful glances she gave me in rooms where other people praised me for something that should have been mine without praise. My body rebelled. Nausea curled up my spine and my knees buckled. I went down hard enough that the sound of it startled us both. A heavy slap of muscle and bone against tile. The bowl tumbled and shattered. Soup spread in a golden ooze across the floor. I rolled onto my side and tried to suck air into a chest that had become a fist. Time fractured into snapshots. Clara crouching, her brow furrowed, her mouth pursed as though she were calculating. My hand reaching for the table leg and missing. The ceiling light blurring into a halo and then a smear. She took my phone from the counter and I thought, absurdly, that she would call an ambulance. That whatever this was had frightened her back into sisterhood. But she slid the phone into her pocket. "I'll get you a towel," she said, and vanished down the hall. The kitchen hummed, refrigerator, light, rain. A cold sweat bloomed on my skin. I shivered despite the heat that rolled under it, my pulse knocking at the door of my throat. I tried to crawl, but my limbs were unstrung. I listened for her, and when she returned, she stood above me and dabbed too carefully at where the soup had splashed my sleeve. "You should rest," she murmured. "You push too hard." I looked up at her, and in the tilt of her head, I recognized something I had only ever caught out of the corner of my eye. Satisfaction wearing a mask of worry. A gaze that said not, "I'm afraid for you, but I'm afraid you won't do what I want." "Clara," I rasped. "Call help." She blinked, slow. "I will," she said, and left me there again. The minutes or hours between that and the door bursting open are lost. The next sharp edge I remember is my neighbor, Mr. Singh, shouting my name as the front door banged against the wall. He had come up to ask about a package. He found me crumpled in the kitchen. And when he knelt, his face became a kind map. Alarm, recognition, decision. "Call emergency!" he yelled over his shoulder to his teenage son in the hall. Clara appeared with a folded blanket and a perfect frown and said, "I was just about to," as if the timing were a coin toss she'd won. Sirens stitched themselves into the rain. The paramedics were brisk with compassion. They lifted me, asked questions my mouth couldn't hold, shone light into my eyes until the world narrowed to a pinprick and then widened, strapped a cuff around my arm to read numbers that made them exchange looks I didn't like. Clara hovered and answered for me. "She's been stressed. She hasn't eaten much. She's sensitive to, certain foods." And I tried to speak through the thick wool that had stuffed my throat. But all I pulled out were scraps of sound. In the ambulance, bright plastic and metal and steady beeps, I floated on the edge of inside and out. The roof rattled rain like applause, and the medic's face was the calmest thing I'd ever seen. "Hang in there," he said. and held my gaze as if his eyes were a bridge I could cross. I clung to it, to his voice giving my body instructions, to the faint hope woven into those instructions. At the hospital, fluorescent light turned everything unforgiving. Hands moved me from gurney to bed, voices measured and clipped, a sterile ballet that shamed my apartment's sloppy panic. They drew blood. They pressed stethoscopes to my chest. They asked if I had allergies, chronic illnesses, a history of fainting. I shook my head as best I could. Time thinned and thickened, thinned again. A doctor with gray at his temples and surprising kindness in his eyes told me they were running tests, that my symptoms suggested exposure to something that needed a name, and I gripped the sheet like it was a rope and nodded because I understood he was telling me without telling me, the way doctors do when words have edges too sharp to hand to someone who is still bleeding. The storm outside exhausted itself. Clara arrived in a hurry of concern that never quite took shape. She stroked my hair and whispered that she was sorry, that she should have sat with me, that she should have noticed how exhausted I was. And when she thought no one was watching, she tucked my phone deeper into her bag, as if it were safer there, as if anything of mine might be safer when it wasn't with me. I wanted to leap up and rip it back. I wanted to tell the doctor that my sister had made soup, and that something about it had tasted like the inside of a coin, but my body had grown heavy, and the softness of the pillow became a hand against the back of my head that would not let me rise. A nurse adjusted the rails and squeezed my shoulder, human touch that meant only what it said, and I cried without sound because that small decency anchored me to the idea that not everyone in the world wanted me harmed. When my parents finally arrived, my mother's perfume reached the bed before she did. It was the same floral blend she'd worn to graduations that weren't mine, to celebration dinners where Clara beamed across a cake. She dabbed at her eyes, murmured that it was all so sudden, so frightening, and my father stood with his arms crossed like he could keep the whole situation at bay by sheer posture. "You must take better care of yourself," he told me. And before I could gather breath, Clara slid into their broken space with a gentle sigh and a story about how I'd been studying too hard, how she had made soup to help, how she had gone to get a towel when I spilled it, and then everything had happened so fast. My mother took her hand, squeezed, nodded toward me with strained sympathy, and the old divide opened its mouth in the floor. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them like beads on a string, as if the numbers could keep me from falling. The tests came back dyed in clinical language, and the doctor returned with a careful face. He spoke to me, not to my parents, and said I had ingested something that did not belong in a human body, that it hadn't been an accident of undercooked food or a normal allergic reaction, and that I was fortunate my neighbor had acted quickly. He asked what I had eaten and when. The room balanced on the head of a pin. "Soup," I whispered. "At home." His eyes flicked to Clara and back, but he didn't tilt the room. He just nodded and said they would keep me for observation and that I should rest, that they would report what needed reporting. The word report felt like a lighthouse beam streaking across a black sea, and I latched onto it even as dread rose like a tide. Because if there was a report, if there was a name for what was in my blood, then there was a story being written somewhere outside our usual family script, a version that did not end with me apologizing for making a fuss. After they left me to the rhythm of machines and the clean hush of a ward past midnight, Clara leaned in, her hair falling like a curtain to hide us from the door. And for a heartbeat, I saw the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms when we were small, all knees and fear and warmth. Then she smiled. A minimal thing I'd never seen on her face before. A line drawn with a blade, and said in a voice too soft to belong to anyone but us, "You should have stayed down." The words brushed my cheek and chilled me deeper than the IV. I turned my face toward the window where the rain had finally stopped, and a single street lamp burned in the wet, and I held on to the lamp the way I had held on to the medic's eyes. The nurse's hand, the doctor's fairness. I let the lamp teach me something simple: light indoors. Across the hall, a monitor beeped steadily. In my chest, my heart obeyed its own stubbornness. I thought of the years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into rooms already full of Clara's brightness, of the ways I had been patient and forgiving because patience was supposed to transform pain into meaning, and I felt a new shape form in the hot metal of my anger, cold, honed, usable. I could not prove anything tonight. I did not even have my phone, but there was a report being written, And there would be another and another, and I would heal enough to stand in the kitchen and remember where the pot had come from, where the groceries had been bought, who had seen what at what hour, and I would begin to stitch together something stronger than the kind of love we had been taught to accept. Something that did not require me to lie down quietly when I was told to rest. I closed my eyes and let the machines talk to one another, while the lamp burned beyond the glass, and in that narrow strip of quiet between breaths, I made a promise not out loud, but carved with the same certainty that had always kept me alive in a house where I was an afterthought. If blood ties could be used as a weapon, then I would use truth like a key. If my sister wanted me to never wake again, then my waking would be a beginning she could not control.